Hi, welcome to Board Game Express. Today we're going to look at the sixth game in our Uwe Rosenberg series, Caverna, the Cave Farmers. In Caverna, you're going to be playing a clan of dwarves who are, well, cave farmers. You're each going to have a board where the right side is the inside of your cave where you're going to be building rooms, and you're going to have a left side of the board representing the outside where you're going to be doing a lot of farming. Alright, so let's take a look at the setup. Now, the first thing you're going to need to do is, based on the number of players you have in the game, it's 1 to 7 player game, you're going to have to choose the appropriate game boards to use. So the game will come with 5 of these. 2 of them are the base one. There's another board that is going to be used based on the number of players, 1 to 3, 4 to 7. And then, depending again on how many players you have, you may use 1 or 2 of these additional boards. So I'm going to pretend to set up for a 3-player right here, bluey, Mr. Green, and red again. And that 3-player board uses this extra skinny one. So add that to the left side right there. Alright. Next thing you're going to want to do is lay out all of the rooms or furnishings. Now, let's face it. You can see this is a very busy game. Lots of moving parts. In fact, I mean, it's a little silly, but we've got a Plano board storing all of the actual resources right here because I don't actually have room to put them out on the table. There's different ways that you can do this. You can put them out, but I find that when I put these out when I'm playing with my friends, invariably somebody can't see and has to come over. It's probably easiest just to have everyone download some sort of a file, or like have everyone take turns taking a picture, or someone take a picture and send it to everyone. I mean, we all have phones. And that way a person can easily just kind of scroll on their own time and take a look at these buildings, because otherwise it's kind of hard to see. There's 48 available buildings over here. Unless you've played many times, you're not going to remember what they all do. So just a couple of practical considerations. You're going to set out all your resources: coins, food, warrior tokens, a lot of grain, animals, rocks, wood. So just have everything available. Then you are going to need these 14 what are called action space cards. And at the start of the game, you're not going to have any of these on the board except the one in this slot. So in all versions of the game, you're going to start with this guy, the Wish for Children, and it's going to be in slot 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And then you're going to have this deck of action cards that have numbers on the back, which represent tiers. So the 3 cards with a 1, those are the ones that come out first, tier 1. And then you're going to have 2 cards in tier 2, and then 3 for 3, and then 3 more cards for tier 4. On each turn, you're going to shuffle and add 1 to the game. So just have these at the ready. Finally, for the board itself, you're going to have these 7 what are called harvest markers. And they go in these 7 spaces over here randomly at the start of the game. Again, this is one of those things where, for all practical purposes, you may find it, you may want to just put these out at the beginning. We find that it's just practically easier to put one out when it's time and flip that over, and then when it's next turn, flip the next one. That way, you know, people aren't accidentally bumping them off the board and things like that. So, whichever you need. All right, so that will be all for the actual board itself. Now, for every player, everyone's going to take a set of colors, and you're going to get 5 of these giant discs, which represent your workers, and 3 of these little house-looking things. Those are your stables. And somebody is going to be random first player, so Bluey is going to go first over here. And based on player order, first player is going to get 1 food. Greenie is going to be second and get 1 food. Red player is third. You're going to get 2. And if you have more players after that, everyone else is going to start the game with 3 food. So 1, 1, 2, 3 the rest of the way. Also, give everyone 2 of these player aids. These are going to be extremely helpful. And then finally, you're going to need this near the board. This is the harvest tracker, and it's got these 3 circles over it, and we'll show you what that's for in a moment. All right, so that should be it for setup. Oh, and you cannot see, but off the screen, we have a couple of these tiles. You, of course, are going to need these at your fingertips as well. All right, so let's talk about how to play. Caverna is going to last 12 rounds, so each round corresponds to one of these 12 action spaces. And in each of these rounds, you're going to do 5 things, but it is essentially a worker placement game. That is the bulk of what is going to happen. Now, the first thing you do in each turn, I mentioned earlier, you're going to shuffle up, draw a random action card from the first earliest tier, and put it out into the available space. Now, these spaces are all going to be action spaces that your dwarves can take. You're going to start the game with 2 of them. That's going to be indicated on the player board. So here's a close-up of it. Everyone's player board starts with this initial room that can hold your Papa and Mama dwarf. And then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to refill each of these action spaces if and when it has a resource with a little arrow in it. So for example, this first action space wants to put out some ore, and then this one's going to want to put out some rock, some more rock. A couple of them need food. This one needs food. This one needs food. Let's see, get a little, looks like 1 wood, 1 wood, 1 wood. And 3 wood over here. And I think I need 2 ore and a ruby. So the red one is going to be rubies. And then looks like 2. All right, so set up all of these resources as sort of a generation of improving the action space every turn. Now, you will notice that some of the action spaces also have a second marker. It's got a little parentheses in it. And so what happens is for the action spaces that don't have that, what you're going to do is in all future turns, even if no one takes the action, then this little income is going to build up. So this space is going to get a rock, and if no one takes it on a turn, it's going to get a rock next turn, and it's going to get a rock each and every turn. But this space, by comparison, it has 3 wood, but in parentheses, it has 1 wood. And what that means is if the space is empty, meaning someone has taken it, then you put all 3 on it. But if the space was not taken and it's not empty, you're only going to put 1 in it. So that's what the parenthetical is. That's the amount you put on it if the action space happens to have something on it already. All right. And just note that some of the future action spaces also will have these building pieces, such as the sheep card. All right, so put out a new card, refill all the action spaces with goods, and then the third thing you're doing the turn is the fun part. This is the action worker placement part of the game. And in turn order, everyone's going to put one of their dwarves on any action space. So blue's going to go first, take whatever. Green's going to go second, etc., etc. And then in the first turn, each of you are only going to have 2 workers to use. Now, obviously, the action spaces are going to need some explaining. I'm going to do that in a moment. Now, after everyone has used all of their dwarven workers, then the 4th part of the turn is everyone will take their workers back. Pretty straightforward. And then the final thing that happens is what's known as the harvest. And in each turn, the harvest is going to be a little different. And in many turns, you're going to need to follow this harvest card that everyone has in their player aid. And I will explain the details of this a little later on as well. All right, so those are the 5 parts of each turn. New card, put out new stuff, worker placement, take your workers home, and then do the appropriate harvest. And then rinse and repeat for the course of 12 turns. All right, now let's get into some of the details because they do matter. So I'm not going to explain every single action space. There are a lot, and quite honestly, a lot of them are very self-explanatory, such as this space, which is just get a ton of resources. But I do want to explain a couple of them just so people have an idea of what to and not to do in certain cases. All right, so in these top 2 spaces over here, these are sort of like tunneling actions where in the beginning, your board is going to have 2 available spaces to use. Your initial dwelling, where your mama and papa reside, and then you have an open cabinet over here, and what those are for is to be furnished. Basically, imagine you've cleared out the rock, and then you can build something, just putting a random one, build something there, boom, you got a room. These 2 spaces will have you taking one of these tiles. So there's 2 varieties. There's this side and this side, maybe a little easier to see over here. So this double tile, what's called a double tile. This side of it has two empty caverns where you can put rooms in the future, whereas this side has a cavern and what's called a tunnel complex. Looks like a little plus sign where you kind of just dug out like a little straight line so you can get through. And that's for building mines later on. But these two spaces say, okay, choose one of these tiles and then add it to your board. Now, when you add something to your board, a couple things to consider. One, you have to touch what you have already built over. So your first one cannot sit over here in the middle of nowhere. If you imagine, you have to actually physically tunnel through the cave complex. Second, you'll notice that a couple of spaces have food printed on them. If you cover up the space and you've basically cleared it out, you get access to that food immediately. All right? And you can build as many as will fit on the board. There are, as a little bit of a preview, there are single tiles. There are methods of getting this into play, and so they can be placed as well. And just one sort of final thing to note, these action spaces allow you to take a double tile. If you no longer have room to place your double tile, you cannot use it. You can still take the action to get the resources on it. You probably don't want to. But if you cannot physically put a double tile into your space because you've already filled up, you cannot, as an alternative, put a single down. Like, it's 2 or nothing. So just keep that in mind. So those are those. Now, the 2 on the bottom here, actually 3 on the bottom here in a 3-player game, are very similar, except instead of your cave complex, it's out on your, sort of your pasture area. I guess it starts as a forest, but will become your pasture area. So these allow you to take one of these tiles. Now these tiles, there's only one variety. One side is going to be what they call a meadow, kind of like open grassland, and the other side is going to be a field, so something that has been tilled, waiting for you to put crops on it. Now, similarly to the rule for connectivity in the mountainside, you have a rule for connectivity out here. Your first one, in fact, has to touch this opening of your cave. So again, you're not going to traipsy through the forest and build that out in the middle of nowhere. You're going to do it right outside your cave. So you can put it like that, you can put it like that. And under normal rules, you cannot overhang the board, of course. And same thing, as soon as you cover some food, or as soon as you cover, this is a board space. Well, actually, this is a board space up here. So if like you build out here and then you build a second one later, you get access to the board right away. And those are what these spaces do. So 2 tile extension to your cave, 2 tile extension to your farm. Now, let's take a look at a couple other ones. So this one is just build and get resources, lots of resources. Explore, I'll explain that in a moment. This is after you've already built ore mines. You're going to be able to get more ore. Gaining pumpkins. Alright, now we're getting to some good stuff. So this space here, 2 things. First, you gain a dog, and then you get to what's called furnish a cavern. The definition of furnish a cavern is sort of what I did earlier. You have to have an empty cavern, so totally cleared out, not a tunnel, but like completely open, and then you get to buy one of these 48 lovely new buildings. The cost is going to be printed on the upper left, and the effect, of course, is going to be given on the bottom of the card. And I, of course, cannot go over all of these. There are simply too many, but just to categorize, there are rooms, the orange rooms up here on the left. They give you access to more workers, so each time you want to create a new worker, a new dwarf, you have to have room for them to live in. A lot of the middle ones, the green, help you sort of do something. So you'll make this thing more of this thing, or you get resources more easily, or it reduces the cost of building other things. Lots of effects. And then some of the ones in the bottom right are going to be endgame triggering things. So like at the end of the game, you score if you have a bunch of this or you have a bunch of that. So a lot of variety. Feel free to read on your own time, but a lot of buildings. So that's furnishing a cavern. Permission to buy something and toss it into your already cleared out space. Alright, next couple action spaces that we want to talk about. Probably I'll reveal enough of these. So let's pretend we've moved forward a couple turns so that you can see this part. I think I just drew all of the ones. That's the one. Yeah, that's also a 1. Alright, so these are the arrow 1 cards, the ones you'll run into earlier. And by the time you get the hang of this game, the other ones will tend to make a little more sense as well. All right, this is an example of a building fences and stables action. And there's also, at the bottom, it comes with a sheep every turn. So every turn someone doesn't take it, and including the first turn it comes up, you're going to add a sheep. So technically I should have put a sheep on this earlier. All right, so building fences means you have to already have a pasture that's size 1. So let me go back to my example board here. So here's an example of a size 1 pasture, so 1 open space. If you want to fence that in, it's going to cost you 2 wood, and then you flip it over, and it's going to be worth points, and it becomes a space that can hold some animals. I'll get into the details of that in a moment. If you happen to have 2 of these in a row, so let's say, for example, I had done that earlier in the game, so now I have these 2 touching each other, I can pay 4 wood to create a doubled pasture, a larger pasture which will hold more animals. Now the game will give you a very handy another tile to put on top like that. So that's a double pasture, and you'll notice that it is worth victory points at the end of the game. Victory points are those shield symbols. So that's what the building fences is for. Now the other thing you can do, and by the way, when you go in this action space, everything happens. So it depends on whether a card says or if it says and or. If it says and or, that means you get to do everything. Or sometimes either or. So obviously pay very close attention to exactly what the card says it does. You can also build 1 stable, costs a stone, and let's say green's going to build a stable. That allows you to build this on the board. One of those things. And it also helps hold animals. Now a couple rules about the stable. You cannot put it on a field. That's for sowing crops. You don't build a stable in the middle where you grow crops. You may build it in the forest. Once you build it in a forest, you may no longer turn that forest into a field. You can turn it into a pasture later. You can make it an open space, but you can't turn it into a field. You also don't have to connect. You are allowed to build it out in the middle of nowhere. So it's like you walk through the woods, put up a shed, walked home. Now, the thing is, when you put down a stable, it does not count as clearing the space. So if you built a stable here, you can see there's a boar marker here. That does not count as you don't get the boar. That's not the same as clearing the space. You have to like clear the space and it's like, voila, I found a boar. All right, so that's how stables work. I'll leave that there for now. And then, there we go. Let's talk about these things. So actually, I'm going to talk about this real quick while we ignore this axe and shield symbol, because that's one of the more interesting aspects of this game. This is a build an ore mine action, and this is what an ore mine looks like. So here's just a visual of it. Now, the requirement for an ore mine is that it must be built on top of, and you'll be able to see this when you have access to the card, it must be built on top of 2 tunnels that are side by side touching each other. So for example, you would have had to build 2 of these, because none of these come with a double tunnel. You would have had to build 2 of these at some other point during the game and arrange them so that the 2 tunnels are touching each other. And then you get to throw an ore mine on top. Voila. Now you got an ore mine. And there will be a space in the future that allows you to put something on top of the ore mine. So a little bit of stacking. So that's what that action space does. Now, let's get to perhaps the most interesting action space. And for those of you who are familiar with some of Uwe's other games, but not this one in particular, this might be the most interesting one for you, the blacksmithing space. So one of the things that can happen to your dwarves in this game is that they can become warriors, because really, what's a dwarf if they are not like, helmet, screaming, chopping, right? So in this action space, you pay ore, 1 to 8, to turn your dwarf into a warrior. And you will turn into a warrior of level equal to however much ore you paid. So let's say, for example, I pay 5 ore, right? So I'm going to take a 5 marker over here, and my dwarf is now a level 5 warrior. What the purpose of this is, when you go on an action space that has this shield symbol, the number inside tells how many times you get to score an exploration, which is this thing. So each time you go on an exploration, you get to take 1 reward up to the level indicated by the strength of your dwarf. So I have a level 5 dwarf over here, so I can look on the chart and I can say, well, I can take anything on row 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, basically up until the pig. And one of the bonuses at the very, very top, if you can see it, is you can increase the level of all of the weapons in your entire clan. Because in the beginning, you're not going to start with any warriors, but each time you send a new person to create a weapon, that you will have another warrior. You can definitely have many warriors during the game. In fact, you can even have all your guys be warriors if you wanted to. It's not easy, but definitely possible. So, claim rewards. Of important note is when you claim these rewards, and you're often going to be claiming multiple rewards, you may not choose the same one twice. So you have to claim different rewards. So like maybe a level 5, maybe I'll take a pumpkin, I'll take a pig, and I'll take some ore, whatever. Some stone, whatever. So 3 different things. And at the end of your exploration, your dwarf gains experience, levels up. So now he was a 5. Ta-da! He's now a level 6. He's a little stronger than he used to be. Now, that is how weaponsmithing works. Something to understand, though, there is a trade-off to this. A dwarf that has become a warrior can still do all the normal actions, but as a bonus, he can now do these explore actions. So there's one here, there's one here, one here. They are stronger, but then there's a downside. When you have multiple dwarves, so let's say, for example, it's later in the game, and I have 3 workers to play, and one of my dwarves is a warrior, level 6 warrior. Here's the problem. When you play your workers out during your turn, you must go from order of smallest to highest warrior strength. Now, of course, non-warriors count as 0. They are by default the smallest. So, I must play this one. Excuse me. I must play this guy first, this guy second, and this guy's got to wait till the end of the line before he gets the space. And if you have more workers than another player, and they also have warriors, they may get to cut in front and then take these juicy action spaces before your nice big warrior gets his turn, which is a little bit of a problem. So, that problem is resolved by rubies. One of the things that a ruby can do, one of the most useful things, is that it allows a dwarf to cut in line in your own order. So I can pay a ruby, and then I can say, well, I'm going to put him out first, and then go wherever you want. And then these guys, of course, now are my second and third placements. So very important to keep in mind. Your highest warriors always go last of all your people, and you can pay a ruby to have one cut in line. Your biggest one will probably be the one that you want to cut in line. And the back of the card, your warriors can get very large, all the way up to level 14, have some pretty nice rewards on them, so just so you know. Alright, so that is the blacksmithing space. And then finally, probably a very good one to talk about is this fella here. So Wish for Children. This space is very important. It's so important that it's a fixed location. It is, even though I put it out at the beginning of the game, maybe you don't want to, just to not give the impression that the card is available. It will not be available until the 4th round of the game. And this is how you can produce more workers. Now, there is a secondary action, which is to furnish a dwelling. It is very similar to the furnish a cavern space, except it only allows you to furnish a dwelling, which is basically a room that holds your workers. And so they are the 6 in orange in the very upper left corner here. It'll be very obvious if you are looking at a game. They will just say dwelling, 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 dwelling. So this space only lets you build one of those things, not any cavern. And the other one is grow a worker. So this is essentially what it looks like. Someday, this action space will become active. And if you have already built a dwelling, so I'm just going to use the very basic dwelling. These are actually, I have not stacked them all. There are 17 in the game, but these are unlimited. If you're crazy and playing with 7 people, and everyone's got a lot of dwarves, you're going to run out of these. These are unlimited, so just find a proxy. So if I build a dwelling, I now have an available space for a new worker. You can take this space and then add your third onto the board. And at the end of the round, when you clean up, that worker will be available starting next turn. And look, it's a worker placement game. More workers, more work. All right. So this is the last sort of key action to talk about. Let me see. Okay, one last one, and then we've sort of covered all the basic action ideas. The final one I want to talk about is this one, which is called a sow action. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Back to our sample board right here. All right. And so let's say, you know what, I'm just going to turn this sideways to make it, I think this will be a little more visible. All right. All right. So for example, there are two fields over here. All right. And what this sow space does is it says, if you already have some grains, so they look like these things, and or some vegetables, they kind of look like little orange pumpkins, right? Then you can plant these and add more onto the board. You can plant up to 2 grains and 2 pumpkins, right? So let's say I had one of each as an example. You would put the one you own onto, it doesn't matter which one, and then you can see on the picture, you add 2 grain from the bank, and then for the pumpkin, you add 1. Close enough. And so sowing basically means, hey, I've planted my seeds in the field, and these things represent harvest in the future. So these, keep in mind, you do not have access to any goods that are sitting in a field like this. It's sort of like it's like a representation of crops that will grow in the future. They don't really exist yet. But for the purposes of scoring at the end of the game, they do count. So just kind of keep that in mind. So that's the last action. You can sow. You can choose to do grain, 2 grains, pumpkin, 2 pumpkins, and the limit for this action space is traditionally 2 of one and 2 of the other maximum. And there's another sow space in here, so there will be multiple opportunities to do that. Let me see. And maybe one last thing to talk about, just as a little bit of a point of clarity. Let me get these out of here. Nice little juggling act. And this action space is a little bit different in that, yes, it is another blacksmithing, so more warrior creation. But you'll notice that these things are separate. There's 2 separate single explorations. So what that actually means is you're going to create your weapon. So let's say I made a level 5. You're going to go on an exploration. You're going to get a reward at level 5. But then you're going to level up because you just did an exploration. And so by the time you do your second one, you're going to be level 6. And then you're going to gain another from that. And you're going to pop out and be level 7. So it's not, that's why it's not just listed as 2. It's 2 individual explorations. All right, that more or less explains all the action spaces in the game. There is an appendix that comes with the game that'll sort of get into the nitty-gritty if you ever have any questions about like precisely how something works. Now, the other things that have to be explained is food and animals, and how do we feed and the harvest. Well, at the end of each turn, there may or may not be a harvest or some version of a harvest. The first 2 turns of the game are printed no harvest, meaning nothing happens. But starting with the 3rd turn, at the end of it, there's this little, kind of like a little green marker symbol, looks like a little leaf, and that means you are going to have the 5th thing of the round, a harvest. And this card very nicely explains what's going to happen. In a regular harvest, the first thing that happens is you are going to be able to harvest some of your crops. So those crops that you put out on your board earlier, you get to bring 1 from each and add it to your supply where it is now available to eat or do whatever else you need with. The second thing is you gotta feed your people, because it just wouldn't be a Uwe Rosenberg game if you didn't have to feed your people. So normal dwarves eat 2 food, so 2 of these. And if you happen to create a new worker on that turn, that worker who has not yet had a chance to act, that one eats 1 food. So if I had 2 workers and I had happened to create one, it's going to be 2, 4, and a fifth, 5 food. And then the final thing that happens on the harvest is you do a breeding for each of the 4 types of animal in the game. So cows, pigs, donkeys, and sheep. Dogs are not considered farm animals. They will not have a breeding cycle, and you can see that in the picture. Now, in order to breed, you have to have at least 2 of said animal, and you must have space to hold the 3rd said animal. So if you have 2 or more of sheep, you will produce 1 sheep. Doesn't matter how many you have. If you have 10, you still produce 1 sheep. And if you have 2 of each of them, which is quite an accomplishment, you will produce 1 of each of those animals as, potentially food in the future. Now, we just started talking about animals. Let's talk about how to house these guys, because there are a lot of different things that happen right here. Well, first thing that happens in the game is your initial room, the home that you start in, can actually hold 1 pair of the exact same type of animal. So you can, dump 2 sheep in there. Keep in mind, one small awkward thing is that that's just room for the sort of mom and pop sheep. There is no room to actually breed another sheep if this is all that you have. So keep that in mind. The second thing that happens is fenced in pastures. If you have fenced in a pasture, that pasture will hold 2 animals per space of the same type. So for example, in this example, I have a 2-space pasture. It'll hold 2 plus 2. It'll hold 4 animals of 1 kind. Apparently, they don't get along, so you can't mix 2 different types of animals. If you had a single pasture, so let's say I had done that previously. Actually, let me use that one as an example. Then that will hold 2. If you put a stable in your pasture, that will double the capacity of whatever that pasture was. So it'll go from a 2 to a 4, or if you do that to a nice big one, it'll turn from 4 to 8 capacity. If you have a single stable out in the middle of nowhere, in a meadow, and there's no fence associated with it, that will be capable of holding 1 farm animal. So in this scenario, you could have 2 sheep in the beginning, and if you had a shed out here in the middle of nowhere, then you can actually breed sheep and get 1 who will sit there. Now, another thing that can happen is you actually can build a shed in the in the forest. So remember, you did not have to build a shed in developed land. You can build it in a forest. If you put a shed in the forest, it is capable of holding exactly 1 and only 1 pig. So, standalone pig. And don't forget, you can clear that forest later and turn it into a meadow. And finally, 2 more things. Every ore mine, so let's say I had built an ore, I have an ore mine, look at that. Every ore mine and every ruby mine can hold 1 and exactly 1 donkey. So, and ruby mines as well. If you upgrade your mines later to a ruby mine, oops, sorry, you're going in the wrong space. So if you upgrade your tunnel into a ruby mine and an ore mine, they can now each hold 1 donkey. And finally, doggies. Doggies are going to go to work. And if you have some dogs, and they sit in the pastures, even without fences, these are working dogs. Because, those are the only kinds they kept around back in the day. Each dog in a pasture can watch 1 more sheep than the number of dogs in the pasture. So a single dog can watch up to 2 sheep. If you did not have this many pastures available and you had 2 dogs sitting in there, those 2 can watch 3 sheep. So, etc., etc. Dogs, meanwhile, are not farm animals. They are workers in a way, kind of subcontracted. They can sit anywhere. They have no restriction. You can have as many dogs as you want, and they can even watch sheep occasionally. So, and let's see, that's so some rooms that you can build. Some of these new furnishings can hold animals as well. There's ones that hold sheep. There's ones that hold cow. Lots of different varieties, but primarily it's fences. Fences is probably the most classic way to hold animals. All right. So what's all this about? Let's put those dogs away. Put those sheep, actually, those sheep are going to come back in a moment. Donkey. Okay, so why are we doing all of this work? Well, it is because eventually you are going to need to feed your workers. And yes, there are ways to directly grab food, and you can also directly grab grain and pumpkins, but you are eventually going to need to create your own little food engine. So let's talk about that. Let me get that out of there, piggy. And let me get these out of there as well. All right. So in the very bottom right corner of your board is going to be a little conversion chart, and definitely you're going to want to get used to using that. One thing that's a little bit tricky to read about this chart is that the very top item, which are these coins that you can collect through various action spaces in the game, which are victory points, by the way, they are not a label. It is not saying, like this first space here, it is not saying a dog is worth 1 coin. That's not what it's saying. It's saying a single coin and a dog is worth no food. That's what it's saying. Basically, it's saying if you try to convert 1 point, you can't, and a dog also cannot be eaten. The next space is saying if you have 2 coins, you can convert 2 coins into 1 food. So it's basically like a tax. If you ever wanted to convert 1, 2, 3, or 4 coins into food, you have to give 1 up as tax, and it becomes 1 less than what you're giving up. A sheep will be worth 1 food, a grain will be worth 1 food, pumpkin will be worth 2, etc., etc. Now, the important thing to understand about these conversions is that you can do them at any time that you want. So right before feeding, the only sort of small timing thing to be careful of is you cannot instantly breed an animal that you did not have room to house and then quote unquote instantly convert him. You remember, you must have room to actually at least temporarily house the new baby to be eligible to receive the breeding. All right, so this is the primary mechanism of getting food in the game, that you are going to just grab stuff, produce stuff, you're going to farm, you're going to do some animal husbandry, and then you're going to convert whenever you need the food. In the event you are short, which hopefully does not happen, you will have to take the classic begging markers, which are worth -3 at the end of the game. Obviously, you want to try to avoid. All right. And finally, last little sort of detail to understand. Let's talk about rubies. Let me just pull out a couple of these things here. Now, at the beginning of the game, this is the only real place to get rubies. This is going to build up over time. And when you take them, you're going to get them. And rubies are going to be worth 1 point each at the end of the game, but please don't use them for that. They're extremely useful. This card on the back of the harvest describes all the things you can do with a ruby. So just like the food conversion chart, this ruby conversion chart is all the things you can do with a ruby at any time you need to. Like basically right before you take an action space or even right after. So some examples of what it's really useful for. You'll notice that it can actually clear forest and or clear caverns. So like you can pop up a single tunnel, you can build one of these right before, let's say you had 1 tunnel and you didn't have a second adjoining tunnel and you wanted to build an ore mine. You can spend a ruby, instantly create a second tunnel, and then bam, take the action space, build the ore mine. That's an example. You can also pull a similar maneuver if you wanted to do sowing. So maybe you have 1 or 2 fields already, but you had a ton of vegetables available, and you wanted a third so that you can plant maybe 2 pumpkins and 1 grain. You can instantly spend any number of rubies to create any number of fields, and then voila, poof, you can sow right from that point. Another thing that's sort of useful is for the breeding cycle. If you're about to go into a harvest, then you've got 1 of a certain animal, and you had a couple rubies available, it might make a lot of sense to create a second of that animal, assuming you have space to house the new babies, so that you are producing as soon as possible. And in particular, you'll see that the cow, which was worth 3 food, if you remember, that is especially powerful. If you can get 2 rubies early, and you had sort of the capacity to get 2 cows and start generating, that is 3 food you are generating every turn. That's paying for 1.5 workers every turn. That is very useful. So that is basically what the rubies are for. All right, so that was a lot of stuff, but 12 turns, and in every turn, set out a new card, load up the action spaces, worker placement, take everyone home, and then do a feeding phase. Now, the last thing to explain about the feeding phase is these symbols down here. After your first 5 turns, you're going to run into the next 7 turns these little harvest marker things. What that basically means is that you will randomly draw one of these and flip it. That happens at the very beginning of the round when you put out your new action card, by the way. And you're going to get one of two things. You're either going to get a little green one. So let's just see it right here. You're either going to get a little green one, which means do a regular harvest, just like normal. Or you're going to get a red one. There are 3 of those in the game. So here's what happens in the event you draw a red one. Well, the first time it happens, goes here, you're not going to have a harvest. And the second time it happens, let's say you draw one of these. So you're not going to have harvest, but you're going to, like the card says, pay 1 food. And then the final one, which is actually more brutal than you think. I just lost the game very recently where I made a mistake processing this thing. You will do most of a harvest, but you either have to skip the harvesting part, like pulling your crops off the fields, or you're going to have to skip the breeding part, one or the other. I chose the wrong one. I actually lost a point because of it, and I lost on tiebreak because of it. That was not fun. So that's the last thing to do about this thing. All right, and those are all the different pieces. And at the end of 12 rounds, you are done. Collect all your stuff, and it's time to score. And there are a lot of things happening in this game, so you have a very convenient little scoring pad. Basically follow to form. Largely every single thing you can acquire in the game is a point. Like rubies are a point, coins are points. Each animal is generally going to be a point. Each grain is half a point. Each vegetable is a point, etc., etc. Go down the list. You're going to score all the points on the various, those won't have it, but like ore mines. There's an ore mine. Ore mines will have victory points on them. Pastures that are enclosed in fences will have points on it. Stables aren't worth anything. But sort of the last thing that you're going to need to do is you are going to have to score all the buildings that have points at the end of the game. So there are a couple games that are strictly for endgame. You're going to have to kind of just follow each one at a time. So count up, and then player with the highest score is going to win. All right, and that is how you play the nice, big, beefy game of Caverna.